Every great civilization eventually fell and was replaced by something else. Rome became medieval Europe. Mesopotamia became ruins. Egypt became a memory in someone else's museum. The Maya built cities of extraordinary sophistication, and then the jungle reclaimed them. The Indus Valley civilization vanished so completely that we still cannot read its writing. These are not failures. They are the normal pattern of human history. Civilizations rise, peak, and are replaced by something different. That is how it works. China did not follow that pattern. China fell many times. But something called China kept returning. Not a faint echo of what came before. Not a distant memory preserved in museums and academic papers. Something living. Something continuous. A civilization that broke apart under conquest and famine and civil war and foreign occupation, and then put itself back together and called itself by the same name and reached back to the same philosophical traditions and asked the same questions its ancestors had asked thousands of years earlier. Few civilizations in recorded history have done this at this scale, across this much time, against this variety of challenges. Think about what that actually means. Every time the armies broke through, every time a dynasty collapsed under its own weight, every time foreign conquerors rode in from the steppes and declared themselves the new masters of the land, something survived. Not just the people, not just the language, something deeper, an idea of what China was, what it meant to belong to this civilization, what kind of thinking and what kind of governance deserved to carry that name forward. This is not a list of emperors and dates you will forget by tomorrow. This is not a highlight reel of pagodas and silk robes and dramatic battles. This is the story of how one civilization, across a historical memory often described as 5,000 years, kept asking the same question every time it broke apart. What are we? And how do we survive what is coming? The answer changed every time, but the question never stopped. By the end of this documentary, you will not just know what happened in China. You will understand why it kept happening. And you will understand why a question first asked in river valleys thousands of years ago is still being answered today. Chapter 1. Before China, the world that made it possible. Before there was a China, there was a landscape that made large-scale organization unusually necessary. Not because the land was generous, because it was not. Start with water. 2 river systems define the geography of what we now call China. And everything about this civilization flows from understanding what those rivers actually were. Not the poetic, life-giving rivers of national mythology. The real ones. The Yellow River, called the Huanghe in Chinese, runs across the north. It earned its name from the enormous quantities of yellow silt it carries down from the Los Plateau. It earned another name from the people who depended on it across thousands of years, China's sorrow. The Yellow River flooded with a destructive unpredictability that few other major river systems in the ancient world matched. It shifted its course dramatically and repeatedly over centuries. At various points in history, it changed its outlet to the sea by hundreds of miles, wiping out entire communities that had built their lives along what they believed was stable ground. Living next to the Yellow River was not a choice made out of comfort. It was a gamble taken because the alternatives were worse. The silt the river deposited, a fine yellowish sediment called loess, was extraordinarily fertile when the floods cooperated. Millet and later wheat could grow here with a productivity that the drier surrounding landscape could not match. Communities formed because the land was productive enough to support them, even when that productivity came wrapped in danger. But here's the consequence that shaped everything that followed. You cannot manage a river like the Yellow River alone. The irrigation channels that made the fertile land productive required coordinated labor across entire communities. The embankments that offered some protection against flooding required organized effort beyond what any single family or village could provide. When the river shifted and the channels silted up, clearing them required the kind of large-scale mobilization that only a functioning hierarchy could organize. The landscape did not just feed the people who lived along it. It trained them. Across thousands of years and hundreds of generations, to expect and accept large-scale collective organization, to understand that survival required hierarchy, that someone had to coordinate the whole system. Because if the whole system failed, everyone suffered together. That instinct, the deep cultural expectation that governing authority exists to manage the relationship between the community and the forces threatening it, runs through every dynasty in this documentary. It shapes how Chinese people thought about legitimate government for 5,000 years. In some fundamental sense, it is still shaping things today. The earliest evidence of organized human settlement in this region reaches back roughly 10,000 years, but the cultures that matter most for our story begin taking recognizable shape around 5000 BCE during the Neolithic period. Two cultures in particular left enough behind for us to understand something of what they built. The Yangshao culture, centered along the middle Yellow River Valley, produced painted pottery of remarkable sophistication. Their villages were organized around shared spaces in ways suggesting genuine community governance. Their dead were buried with deliberate care, pointing to developed ritual and belief in something beyond physical death. They grew millet, raised pigs, and almost certainly held ceremonies connecting the living to their ancestral dead. That connection between the living and the ancestors is one of the oldest threads in Chinese civilization, running unbroken from these Neolithic villages through every dynasty to the present. Then, roughly 1,000 years later, around 4000 BCE, the Longshan culture emerged and spread across a broader territory. Longshan sites show something the Yangshao sites do not show at the same scale. And it is a detail that comfortable narratives about ancient China tend to skip past. Walls. Defensive walls around settlements. Not decorative boundaries. Serious defensive structures built to keep other people out. Evidence of organized communities preparing for conflict with other organized communities. This matters because it breaks the myth of peaceful agricultural origins. The same centuries that produced more sophisticated farming and more organized community life also produced the earliest clear evidence of systematic violence in this part of the world. As communities became more productive, they became worth taking. As populations grew, land and water became contested. As hierarchy developed inside communities, competition developed between them. By roughly 2300 BCE, the archaeological record begins showing something qualitatively different. Sites with palatial structures, specialized production, and the kind of administrative complexity that belongs to a state rather than a village. The earliest Chinese written records, compiled long after these events, describe this period as the age of the 3 sovereigns and 5 emperors, a series of legendary rulers who gave humanity agriculture, writing, medicine, and the principles of good governance. Modern historians treat these figures as mythological, but myths are not created from nothing. They are built from the residue of things that once mattered enough to remember. What those legends preserve, even if not in literal historical fact, is the memory of a transition. A moment when the people of the Yellow River Valley began to understand themselves not just as a community occupying a particular place, but as a civilization carrying a particular inheritance. Not just people who live somewhere, people who were something. That sense of being something, fragile and unformed as it was in those Neolithic river valleys, is the thread that runs through everything that follows. The question this documentary asks is how that thread survived everything that tried to cut it. Chapter 2. The First Dynasty That May Not Have Existed, Xia and the Problem of Origins. Every civilization needs a beginning it can believe in, not just a factual starting point. A moralone, a story that explains not only where the people came from, but why they deserve to be here, why their way of organizing the world is legitimate, why those who held power before them passed it forward through virtue rather than having it seized by force. China is no different, and the beginning China chose, the foundation that many subsequent dynasties for thousands of years would point back to as the source of legitimate rule, is a dynasty called the Xia. The problem is that we cannot prove it existed. This is not a minor academic dispute. It's and the answer tells us something far more important than a simple timeline ever could. The traditional account of the Xia comes primarily from texts written more than 1,000 years after the dynasty supposedly ended. The most important of these is the Shiji, meaning records of the grand historian, compiled by Sima Qian around 90 BCE. Sima Qian was a meticulous historian by the standards of his time, genuinely concerned with accuracy in ways many ancient writers were not. He listed the Xia rulers by name, described their reigns, recorded their achievements and failures with the care of someone who believed he was writing real historical fact. But Sima Qian was working from sources that were already ancient when he consulted them, and from oral traditions that had passed through dozens of generations before anyone committed them to writing. How much of what he recorded was genuine historical memory, and how much had been shaped by the political needs of the dynasties that came after? That question has no clean answer. It may never have one. What the traditional sources tell us is this: the Xia dynasty was founded by a man called Yu, known to history as Yu the Great. Yu earned his place in legend not through military conquest, but through something far more practical, given everything we know about the Yellow River landscape. Far more believable flood control. According to the texts, Yu spent 13 years organizing the management of catastrophic flooding that had devastated communities across the Yellow River Valley. He dredged channels, redirected waterways, and built embankments that gave the land back to the people. He was so dedicated to this work, the stories say, that he passed his own home 3 times during those 13 years without stopping to go inside. Whether or not Yu was a real individual, the story preserves something true about the political culture that eventually produced it. The ideal ruler in early Chinese political thought was not primarily a warrior or a priest. He was someone who managed the relationship between the community and the natural forces threatening it. The connection between governing authority and flood control that runs through Chinese political culture for the next 5,000 years begins, symbolically at least, with Yu. Yu established the Xia and passed rule to his son, rather than to a chosen successor outside his family. This established the principle of hereditary monarchy that would define Chinese political organization for the next 4,000 years. Then, after somewhere between 4 and 5 centuries depending on which source you consult, the Xia were overthrown by the founders of the next dynasty, the Shang, on the grounds that the last Xia king had become corrupt, cruel, and therefore unworthy of rule. Pause on that detail, because it is not just a story about the end of the Xia. It is the first appearance of a political logic that will drive every major dynastic transition in Chinese history. The Shang did not simply claim to be stronger than the Xia. They claimed the Xia had lost the right to rule, that there was a moral condition attached to political power, that heaven, or whatever supreme force governed the universe, had withdrawn its approval from the Xia because of their failures and transferred it to someone more deserving. This idea, still unnamed at this point, will become one of the most powerful and most dangerous political concepts in all of Chinese history. We will meet it properly in Chapter 4. For now, the question of whether the Xia actually existed remains genuinely open. In the 1980s and 1990s, Chinese archaeologists excavating a site called Erlitou in Hainan province found something that shifted the debate, though it did not resolve it. Erlitou, occupied roughly between 2000 and 1500 BCE, according to current archaeological dating, showed palatial structures, evidence of sophisticated bronze casting, road networks, and signs of significant political organization. By most reasonable definitions, it was a state, not a village. Whether Erlitou was the Shai capital, a predecessor state, or an entirely separate political entity remains genuinely contested among specialists. Chinese archaeological institutions have generally identified the connection as established. Many scholars outside China are more cautious, noting that the absence of contemporary written records from the site makes definitive identification impossible with current evidence. The honest position is that Erlitou demonstrates a sophisticated Bronze Age state in exactly the right time and place to be connected to the Xia tradition. While the specific connection cannot yet be proven, what can be said with confidence is this: something real existed in that river valley in the centuries before the Shang. Something organized enough to leave behind palace foundations and bronze workshops and a settlement of genuine urban scale. Whether it carried the name Xia or not, it was the kind of political entity that later Chinese civilization needed to believe was its ancestor. And that need? The political and cultural necessity of having a legitimate origin point is as real as anything in the archaeological record. Many subsequent Chinese dynasties pointed back to Yu the Great as evidence that their rule stood in a line of legitimate succession stretching back to the beginning of civilization itself. The Shang used the Xia to justify overthrowing them. The Zhou used both to justify overthrowing the Shang. The pattern continued for millennia. A civilization built its entire political philosophy on the example of a dynasty it could not prove existed. That is not weakness. That is a choice. And understanding why that choice was made tells you more about how China works than any verified list of dates and rulers ever could. Chapter 3. Shang, the dynasty that wrote its own bones. In the summer of 1899, a Chinese scholar named Wang Yurong fell ill with malaria and sent for traditional medicine. Among the ingredients prescribed was a substance pharmacies sold under the name dragon bones, which were, in practice, ancient animal bones ground into powder and sold as a remedy. According to the most widely circulated account of this discovery, Wang Yirong examined some unprepared bones before they could be ground and noticed markings that looked unmistakably like ancient writing. What he had found was one of the most significant archaeological discoveries of the modern era. Those bones were not mythical dragon remains. They were oracle bones. Physical records of the Shang dynasty, buried for more than 3,000 years and ending up in Beijing pharmacies because nobody who sold them had any idea what they actually were. The discovery transformed our understanding of ancient China almost overnight. Before 1899, the Shang dynasty was known only from later texts, subject to the same uncertainties surrounding the Xia. After 1899, the Shang became the earliest Chinese dynasty confirmed by contemporary written evidence. We could read, imperfectly and partially, but genuinely, what they had written. We could hear something like their actual voice across 3,000 years of silence. What that voice told us was surprising in ways historians are still fully absorbing. The Shang dynasty, according to current scholarly chronology, ruled from roughly the 16th century BCE to approximately 1046 BCE. Though precise dating of the earlier period remains debated among specialists, they ruled from a capital that archaeologists have identified near the modern city of Anyang in Henan province, a site so extraordinarily rich in artifacts that excavations begun in the 1920s are still yielding new material today. The Shang were Bronze Age rulers of genuine sophistication. Their bronze casting produced ritual vessels of such technical precision that specialists today still study the metallurgical methods used to achieve them. Their cities were planned. Their military was organized. Their trade networks reached across significant distances. But it is the oracle bones that carry the deepest story. Here is how they worked. The Shang king, or a designated diviner acting on the king's behalf, would take a piece of bone, typically the shoulder blade of an ox or the underside of a turtle shell, and pose a question directed toward the royal ancestors or toward a supreme divine force the Shang called Di. The question was inscribed on the bone. Heat was applied until the bone cracked. The pattern of cracks was interpreted as the answer. Sometimes, the result of the divination was inscribed on the bone afterward, creating a record of question, interpretation, and outcome. The questions ranged from the largest to the smallest. Will the harvest be good this season? Will the king win the coming battle? Is this illness caused by an angry ancestor? Should the king travel north or south? Will the queen's labor go safely? Read enough of them, and something remarkable happens. The Shang king stops being a distant historical abstraction and becomes something recognizably human. Worried, uncertain, asking questions that do not always receive the answers he hoped for. Some follow-up inscriptions record, with what reads almost like dry bureaucratic honesty, that the prediction turned out to be wrong. But here is the detail that most popular accounts of Shang history pass over, and it is the detail that matters most. The oracle bone inscriptions were not private communications between a nervous king and his gods. They were political documents. Consider what it means to inscribe your question to the ancestors on a physical object. Interpret the divine response. Record the outcome, and store the whole exchange in a royal archive. It means the king's relationship with divine authority is not personal and invisible, but institutional and demonstrable. Every divination is also a performance of legitimacy, a demonstration, conducted in writing and preserved in records, that the Shang king stood at the intersection of the human and the divine in a way that no one else could claim. Every oracle bone reading was simultaneously a religious consultation and a political act. The bones were a technology of power as much as a technology of faith, and they required writing, which means the development of the Chinese script, one of the most consequential intellectual achievements in human history, was driven at least partly by the political necessity of documenting royal authority and divine communication. The characters on the oracle bones are recognizably ancestral to modern Chinese characters. A trained reader of classical Chinese can identify many of them directly. This is not true of other ancient writing systems. Egyptian hieroglyphics bear no relationship to any modern script. Mesopotamian cuneiform became entirely extinct as a living tradition. But the writing system developed by Shang diviners 3,000 years ago is, in evolved and modified form, still in use today. That continuity is not accidental. It is one of the central mechanisms through which Chinese civilization survived everything that tried to end it. The Shang also practiced something their oracle bones record without concealment, and which requires honest acknowledgement. Human sacrifice at significant scale was a regular feature of Shang religious and political life. Archaeological excavations at Anyang have uncovered burial pits containing the remains of people killed to accompany powerful individuals into death. The oracle bones record divinations about how many people should be sacrificed for particular ceremonies, with numbers sometimes reaching into the dozens or more for major royal rituals. This was not an occasional aberration. It was institutionalized. Acknowledging it matters not to pass judgment across 3,000 years, but because it measures the distance Chinese civilization would travel in the centuries that followed. Later Chinese thinkers, the philosophers of the Warring States period, who gave Chinese civilization its ethical foundations, explicitly rejected the sacrificial traditions of the Shang and built systems of thought centered on human dignity and benevolent governance. That philosophical revolution did not happen in a vacuum. It happened partly in reaction to a tradition exactly like this one. The Shang were eventually overthrown by a people from the West called the Zhou. The Zhou justified their conquest using the same argument the Shang had used to justify overthrowing the Xia, the last Shang king, had been so cruel and morally degraded that heaven itself had withdrawn its approval from his rule. The Shang had used this logic as a weapon against their predecessors. Now it was being used against them. A pattern was forming. A logic of power was taking shape. And the idea at the center of that logic was about to receive the philosophical framework that would make it the most influential political concept in the history of Chinese civilization. Chapter 4. Zhou and the Mandate of Heaven, the most dangerous idea in Chinese history. In the year 1046 BCE, a coalition led by a man known to history as King Wu of Zhou defeated the last Shang king near the Shang capital and ended a dynasty that had ruled for centuries. The military victory was complete. The political problem it created was immediate. How do you tell millions of people that the dynasty they have known their entire lives, whose king claimed a direct channel to the divine forces governing the universe, has just been legitimately replaced by someone who was, until very recently, a subordinate ruler on the western frontier? How do you make conquest look like correction rather than crime? You need more than an army. You need an argument. The argument the Zhou produced was so elegant, so philosophically resonant, and so structurally double-edged that it would govern Chinese political thought for the next 3,000 years. They called it Ming, the Mandate of Heaven. The logic ran like this. Heaven, understood not as a personal god in the Western theological sense, but as the supreme moral force ordering the universe, granted the right to rule to those who deserved it. Deserving it meant governing justly, caring genuinely for the welfare of the people, maintaining the proper rituals that kept the human world aligned with the cosmic order. A ruler who fulfilled these obligations had the mandate of heaven. His authority was real. His rule was legitimate. But here was the part that made it dangerous. A ruler who failed these obligations, who became cruel or corrupt or indifferent to the suffering of those under his governance, lost the mandate of heaven, not just politically, morally. Heaven itself had withdrawn its approval. His continued rule was no longer legitimate governance. It was usurpation of an authority he no longer held. And how would anyone know when heaven had withdrawn its mandate? The Zhou had an answer. Natural disasters, famines, military defeats, widespread popular suffering and unrest. These were not random misfortunes. They were signals, evidence that heaven was communicating its displeasure through the visible consequences of the ruler's failures. And if heaven had genuinely withdrawn its mandate, then whoever had the strength and the virtue to replace him was not a rebel or a traitor. He was the new bearer of heaven's approval. His conquest was not an act of violence against legitimate authority. It was cosmic correction. Now pause and think carefully about what the Zhou had actually created. They invented a political philosophy that justified their own seizure of power. That much is unremarkable. Every conqueror needs a justification. But in doing so, they created something with consequences far beyond their own ambitions. They created a permanent, philosophically grounded justification for any future rebellion against any future ruler who could plausibly be characterized as having failed the people. Every peasant uprising in Chinese history for the next 3,000 years, every general who decided his emperor had become unworthy, every regional commander who marched on the capital with ambitions of his own, all of them reached for the same framework the Zhou had invented. All of them said, in essence, heaven has withdrawn its mandate from the current ruler, and the evidence is the suffering you see around you. I am not destroying legitimate authority. I am restoring it. The mandate of heaven was the most powerful political gift the Zhou gave to everyone who would ever want to overthrow a Chinese government. They almost certainly did not intend it that way. The Zhou dynasty itself lasted, in nominal form, for nearly 800 years, making it the longest ruling dynasty in Chinese history by a considerable margin. But that longevity is misleading. The Zhou period divides into two fundamentally different phases, and the line between them marks one of the sharpest turning points in the entire story. The Western Zhou, governing from their capital near modern Xi'an, ruled through a system distributing territories to relatives and allied nobles in exchange for military service and ritual acknowledgement of Zhou supremacy. The system functioned as long as the Zhou king commanded enough actual military power to enforce the obligations it required. In 771 BCE, that power collapsed. Nomadic peoples from the northwest attacked the Zhou capital and killed the king. The surviving Zhou royal family fled east, established a new capital near modern Luoyang, and continued ruling. In name, the Eastern Zhou kings survived for another 500 years. But real power had shifted permanently to regional lords governing their own territories with increasing independence and decreasing regard for Zhou authority. The Zhou king became, gradually and then completely, a ceremonial figurehead, a symbol of legitimacy without the armies or revenues to enforce his will on anyone. What followed was escalating conflict among the regional states that historians divide into two phases. The Spring and Autumn period, roughly 722 to 476 BCE, saw dozens of states competing, allying, betraying, and absorbing each other in patterns of constantly shifting power. Then the Warring States period, roughly 475 to 221 BCE, saw that competition escalate into warfare of a scale and brutality and the earlier period had not matched. States fielded armies, numbering in the hundreds of thousands. Battles produced casualty figures on a scale that European warfare would not see until the modern era. The Zhou political order had produced a world of extraordinary, organized violence. And yet this world of extraordinary violence also produced the most consequential outpouring of philosophical thought in Chinese history. Ideas so fundamental that they became the operating system of every Chinese government for the next 2,000 years. To understand why catastrophe produced genius, we need to go directly into the world of the people who lived through this chaos and refused to accept that it was simply how things had to be. Chapter 5. The Age of 100 Schools, when China thought for the world. Here is a question worth sitting with before we go any further. Why does catastrophe sometimes produce the deepest thinking? Not always. Most catastrophes produce only suffering and the grinding work of survival. But occasionally, in specific places, at specific moments, when the old certainties have collapsed and the old answers have demonstrably stopped working, something unexpected happens. The intellectual constraints that stable societies enforce, the shared assumptions about what is true and what questions are worth asking, dissolve along with everything else. And in that dissolution, space opens for ideas that would never have been imaginable when the world seemed to be functioning. The Warring States period in China was one of those moments. Possibly the greatest such moment in the intellectual history of our species. The Zhou political order was visibly dying. The mandate of heaven had become a tool any warlord with a large enough army could invoke. The ritual systems that were supposed to hold society together were being performed cynically by rulers with no genuine commitment to what the rituals meant. States rose and fell within living memory. Millions of people died in wars whose justifications became harder to maintain with every generation of bloodshed. Into this crisis walked an extraordinary number of thinkers who refused to accept that this was the permanent condition of human existence. They asked, with the urgency of people watching their world fall apart in real time, what is the right way to organize human society? What makes a ruler legitimate? What do human beings actually owe each other? What is the nature of the universe? And what does that tell us about how to live? The answers they gave were so varied, so passionately argued, and so profoundly consequential that Chinese scholars named this period the 100 Schools of Thought. It was not literally 100 schools. It was an explosion of competing philosophical traditions unlike anything the world had seen in a single civilization before. We cannot meet all of them, but we must meet the four whose ideas shaped everything that followed. The first is the thinker most Westerners have at least heard of, even if most know little of what he actually argued. His Latinized name is Confucius, given by Jesuit missionaries who encountered his teachings in the 16th and 17th centuries. His Chinese name was Kongqiu, and he lived approximately 551 to 479 BCE. During the spring and autumn period, when the Zhou order was fraying but had not yet collapsed into the full violence of the Warring States. Confucius was not primarily a religious figure in the sense that word carries in the Western tradition. He made no claim to divine revelation. He offered no promise of salvation or afterlife. He was a thinker consumed by a practical problem. Why had the relatively harmonious social order he believed had existed under the early Zhou broken down? And what would it actually take to restore it? His answer centered on relationships. 5 fundamental relationships he believed structured all of human social life, ruler and subject, parent and child, husband and wife, older brother and younger brother, and friend and friend. Each relationship carried specific obligations running in both directions. The ruler owed benevolent governance to the subject. The subject owed loyal service to the ruler. The parent owed genuine nurturing to the child. The child owed genuine respect and care to the parent. The key virtue holding everything together was Ren, most commonly translated as benevolence or humanness. The ruler of Ren governed not for personal advantage, but from genuine concern for the welfare of those under his authority. The official of Ren served not from fear or ambition, but from real commitment to the public good. Confucius spent much of his life attempting, and largely failing by his own account, to persuade the rulers of his time to govern this way. He traveled from state to state, offering his services as an advisor, was received with interest and dismissed when his advice proved politically inconvenient. He was not a political success in his own lifetime, but his students preserved his teachings with exceptional care, and those teachings were refined and systematized over the following centuries by thinkers who deepened the tradition in different directions. Mencius believed human nature was fundamentally oriented toward goodness and could be cultivated toward virtue through the right environment and education. Sunzi believed human nature required active shaping through ritual and education to prevent it from defaulting toward selfishness. These two thinkers drew opposite conclusions from the same tradition. That internal debate, optimistic versus skeptical about human nature, is worth noting because it shows that Confucianism was never a single fixed doctrine. It was a living tradition of argument. And that capacity for internal debate is part of what made it resilient enough to survive 2,000 years of changing political circumstances. For those 2,000 years, the Chinese imperial bureaucracy was staffed primarily by men who had studied Confucian texts and been examined on their understanding of Confucian principles. The standard by which Chinese rulers were publicly judged was fundamentally Confucian. That is not a minor intellectual influence. That is a civilization running on a particular philosophical operating system for 2 millennia. The second thinker is in many ways Confucius's philosophical mirror image. Where Confucius looked backward toward a recoverable golden age of proper social order, this thinker looked inward, or perhaps beyond, toward something that could not be systematized at all. His name was Laozi, meaning old master, and whether he was a single real individual or a name attached to a tradition developed over generations remains debated among specialists. The text attributed to him, the Tao Te Ching, is among the most translated works in human history and among the most genuinely difficult to fully render in any language other than the classical Chinese in which it was written. The Tao Te Ching describes a force called the Tao, the way, that underlies all of reality and cannot be captured in language. The moment you define it precisely, you have already missed it. The universe operates according to the Tao naturally, without forcing. The ideal ruler governs through Wu Wei, a quality often translated as non-action or effortless action, allowing things to find their natural course rather than imposing an artificial order on them. This sounds like political passivity to modern ears. It was not intended that way. It was a critique, sharp and specific, of exactly the kind of aggressive controlling governance that was producing such devastation in the warring states world. The harder you force, the more you break. The tighter you grip, the faster things escape you. Taoism never became official state philosophy the way Confucianism did, but it never disappeared. It ran as a persistent and vital countercurrent through 2,000 years of Chinese intellectual and artistic life. giving people a framework for the private, contemplative, and spiritual dimensions of existence that the public-facing Confucian tradition did not fully address. The third thinker is far less known in the West, but arguably the most honest about what he saw happening around him. His name was Han Feizi, and he lived in the 3rd century BCE, in the final and bloodiest phase of the Warring States period. He had received a Confucian education in his youth. Then he looked at the actual world and concluded that Confucianism, however admirable its ideals, was dangerously naive about the reality of political power. Rulers did not govern badly because they lacked moral education. Han Feizi argued. They governed badly because the structural incentives of political power pushed them towards self-interest, regardless of their personal character. What governance required was not better men, but better systems. Clear laws, consistently enforced, predictable rewards for compliance, and predictable punishments for violation. Applied impersonally regardless of the violator's rank or connections. Han Feizi was the founding theorist of the school called legalism, cold in its assumptions about human nature, relentless in its logic, and genuinely revolutionary in its core insight that good governance was an engineering problem as much as a moral one. His ideas were read with great interest by the ruler who would, within years of Han Feizi's own death, to accomplish what no one had managed in centuries, the complete military unification of China under a single authority. But before we reach that man, we need one more thinker. One whose ideas were perhaps the most radical of all, and whose influence history has consistently underestimated. His name was Mozi, and he lived approximately 470 to 391 BCE, where Confucius argued for graded moral obligations, stronger toward family and those closest to you, and weaker toward strangers. Mozi argued for something he called Jian.A, universal and impartial caring. Every human being deserved the same moral consideration. Mozi insisted, regardless of their relationship to you, the suffering of a stranger carried exactly the same moral weight as the suffering of your brother. If rulers and ordinary people genuinely adopted this principle, the wars and exploitation that defined the Warring States world would become impossible, because no one would be willing to inflict on others what they would not accept being inflicted on themselves. Mohism was enormously influential during the 4th and 3rd centuries BCE. Then, with striking suddenness, it essentially disappeared as an organized philosophical movement after the Qin unification. The most persuasive explanation is that its insistence on universal human moral equality put it in direct structural conflict with both the Confucian emphasis on hierarchical family obligations and the legalist emphasis on state authority, making it politically incompatible with any of the power structures that survived. The idea did not die entirely. Echoes of Mohist thinking appear in later Chinese Buddhism, in popular religious ethics, and in the arguments of thinkers across many centuries who pushed back against the assumption that proximity to power determined whose suffering mattered. Now, step back and look at what these 4 thinkers, and the dozens of others flourishing alongside them, were actually doing. They were not writing in comfortable institutions during peaceful times. They were thinking in the middle of a civilization tearing itself apart. Every one of them had lived with the knowledge that the political world around them could collapse within a human lifetime. And every one of them responded not with despair, but with the conviction that careful thinking about how human beings should treat each other was the most urgent practical necessity of dangerous times. That conviction itself, the belief that ideas about ethics and governance have real consequences for real people, and are therefore worth the most serious intellectual effort, is one of the most important inheritances the Warring States period gave to Chinese civilization. The chaos was real. The violence was real. The suffering was real. But the ideas outlasted everything else. And, among the rulers paying closest attention to those ideas, particularly the legalist ones, was a young king in the western state of Qin who had his own answer to the question of how to end the chaos. His answer was not subtle. Chapter 6. Qin, the man who broke everything to build one thing. In 221 BCE, a 38-year-old king sat in his capital and confronted a situation that no one in Chinese history had ever confronted before. He had won. Not partially, not temporarily, completely. After a decade of campaigns that had consumed the last remnants of the Warring States order, Yangshao, king of the state of Qin, had done what the mandate of heaven theoretically promised, but centuries of chaos had prevented. He had conquered every other state. The centuries of fragmentation that had defined Chinese political reality for so long that most living people had never known anything else were over. The question was what to do with the victory. Yangzhang's answer would shape China for the next 2,000 years. Not because everything he built survived. Almost none of it did in the form he intended. His dynasty lasted 15 years. It collapsed in one of the most spectacular political implosions in Chinese history, barely 4 years after his own death. But the problem he identified, and the solutions he attempted, set the terms of Chinese governance so completely that every dynasty that came after was still working within those terms, whether it acknowledged his influence or preferred not to. The problem was this: 7 states had been unified by military force. Those 7 states had different legal systems, different written scripts, different currencies, different systems of weights and measures, and different administrative traditions developed over centuries of independent existence. Military conquest had placed them under one ruler. It had not made them one country. Yangzhang understood this distinction with remarkable clarity. Winning the war was the achievable part. Building something that would last was the real challenge. His first move was symbolic, but carried real political weight. He rejected the title of king as inadequate for what he had achieved. Every ruler of every warring state had called himself king. He needed something categorically different. By combining 2 ancient terms associated with legendary sage rulers and divine authority, he created a new title, Huangdi, Emperor. He was Qin Shi Huangdi, the first emperor of Qin. The title was itself a political statement. He was not a king among kings. He was something new, and his stated expectation, preserved in the records of his court, was that his dynasty would continue for 10,000 generations. It lasted 3 emperors and 15 years. But before the collapse, the first emperor attempted something the ancient world had rarely seen: the systematic standardization of an entire civilization from above. He standardized the written script. Different states had developed divergent forms of Chinese characters sufficient to create genuine communication difficulties across regions. The Qin imposed a single standardized script across the entire empire. A document produced in the far south could now be read by an official in the far north. The bureaucratic machinery of empire required a common written language, and the first emperor created one by force. He standardized weights and measures across the empire. He replaced the various state currencies with a single imperial coinage. He built thousands of miles of roads radiating from the capital to every part of the empire. Built partly for commerce and communication, and very explicitly for the rapid movement of military force to any location where rebellion might emerge. He abolished hereditary noble governance of territories, replacing it with appointed officials who served at imperial pleasure and could be removed and replaced. This was not administrative reorganization. It was the deliberate dismantling of the aristocratic power structure that had governed China under the Zhou for centuries. And then he burned the books. More precisely, in a policy shaped by his chief minister Li Si and others at court, the first emperor, in 213 BCE, ordered the collection and destruction of texts deemed dangerous to imperial authority. The Confucian classics, historical records of the former states, philosophical works that could be used to criticize current governance by reference to alternative models of legitimate rule. The reasoning was explicit and, within its own logic, coherent. If scholars can point to historical examples of better governance, they will use those examples to criticize the current government. The solution was to control the past by destroying the versions of it that the state did not authorize. Copies were preserved in the imperial library under state control. Everything else was to be surrendered and burned. Historical accounts describe several hundred scholars being executed the following year for violations of these edicts. Though the precise numbers in ancient sources should be understood as approximations rather than verified counts, the burning of the books was not total. Many texts survived, hidden by scholars willing to risk their lives. When the Qin collapsed, scholars emerged with memorized texts and hidden copies and worked to reconstruct what had been lost. The damage was real but incomplete. The political meaning of the act was complete. The first emperor understood that ideas were as threatening as armies, and he attempted to conquer them by the same method he had used to conquer states. It did not work. Ideas turned out to be harder to burn than books. Alongside these projects, the first emperor built a tomb complex of staggering ambition outside his capital. Modern archaeology has revealed within it more than 8,000 terracotta soldiers, each individually modeled, equipped with real bronze weapons, organized in military formation. He was obsessed with death and with the possibility of escaping it. He sent expeditions searching for legendary islands where immortals supposedly lived. He consumed mercury-based compounds recommended by court alchemists as longevity treatments, almost certainly accelerating his physical deterioration rather than reversing it. He died in 210 BCE while traveling, far from his capital. His death was concealed by his ministers for weeks, while court factions maneuvered over the succession. His body was transported back to the capital, alongside carts of fish placed nearby to mask the smell of decomposition. The man who intended to rule for 10,000 generations was dead at around 50. His son, manipulated by court factions, proved unable to manage the empire. Within 3 years of the first emperor's death, rebellions had broken out across virtually every region. Within 4 years, the Qin dynasty was gone. But here is what that collapse actually demonstrates. Almost everything the first emperor built in terms of political structure was retained by the dynasty that replaced him. The standardized script survived. The administrative system of commanderies and counties survived. The concept of a unified empire governed by appointed officials survived. The roads survived. The idea of a single emperor holding supreme authority over all of China survived. The Han dynasty publicly condemned the first emperor's methods while quietly governing from within the framework he had constructed. Every dynasty after the Han did the same. All of them ruled from within the template Yingzheng had built, even as they denounced the man who built it. The most reviled emperor in Chinese history is also, in terms of structural legacy, among the most consequential. The dynasty that lasted 15 years created the template that every subsequent Chinese government worked from for the next 2,000 years. The question Yingzheng had asked, how do you hold a vast and fractured territory together as a single political entity, never stopped being the central question of Chinese governance. He answered it with standardization, centralization, and force. Later dynasties found more durable answers, but they were always answering the same question. And the first dynasty to find an answer that actually lasted was the one that rose from the ruins of the Qing, led by a man who was, in his own way, just as improbable as the empire he inherited. Chapter 7. Han, the dynasty that defined what Chinese means. The man who founded the Han dynasty was not supposed to be emperor. He was not a nobleman, not a military aristocrat from one of the great families of the Warring States period, not a man of education or refinement or the kind of pedigree that Chinese political culture had traditionally associated with legitimate authority. Liu Bang was a minor local official from a peasant background, a man working as a village headman when the Qin dynasty collapsed around him and the world opened up in ways that no one with his origins had any rational basis to expect. By the accounts that survive, Liu Bang in his early years was not particularly impressive. He drank heavily. He was casual about formalities that more aristocratic men observed carefully. His Confucian advisors occasionally recorded their exasperation with him. He was coarse in ways that made the educated officials around him visibly uncomfortable. He was also a political genius of the first order. What Liu Bang understood, with an instinctive clarity that years of classical education had not given the first emperor, was that you cannot hold China together through force alone. The Qin had demonstrated this with brutal efficiency. Force could conquer territory. It could not make people believe their lives were better, their futures more secure, their connection to the governing power something worth sustaining. Liu Bang cut taxes dramatically from the crushing levels the Qin had imposed. He scaled back the enormous forced labor projects that had built the first emperor's infrastructure at the cost of millions of disrupted and destroyed lives. He largely abandoned the legalist framework of rigid law and harsh punishment and replaced it with lighter administration that gave communities more room to manage their own affairs. The early Han was not a well-organized empire. It was a patchwork held together by pragmatic compromise, military reality, and the sheer exhaustion of a population that had lived through decades of warfare and wanted nothing more than to plant their fields in peace. But the patchwork worked. Agricultural production recovered. Population grew. The economy began rebuilding from the devastation of Qin demands and the civil wars that had followed its collapse. And, as stability returned, the Han began asking the question that every stable civilization eventually asks: what are we, really? Not just a military and administrative fact, a civilization. What do we believe? What values hold us together? What kind of people are we? And what kind of people do we want to become? The answer came most completely under the reign of the emperor known as Han Wudi, the martial emperor, who ruled for 54 years, from 141 to 87 BCE, and transformed the Han from a recovering post-war state into the dominant power in Asia. Han Wudi made Confucianism the official state philosophy of the Han Empire. This was not a cultural preference. It was a political decision of enormous structural consequence. The Qing had tried legalism and produced an empire that was efficient, standardized, and profoundly hated. Pure legalism treated people as instruments of state purpose, to be directed, taxed, conscripted, and punished according to state need, with no independent moral standing and no claim on the state's consideration beyond their usefulness to it. Confucianism offered something structurally different. It said that the relationship between ruler and subject was a moral relationship with obligations running in both directions. The ruler owed the people benevolent governance and genuine concern for their welfare. The people owed the ruler loyal service and respect. This gave the Han a language for claiming they were not merely stronger than the Qin, but better, more humane, more genuinely worthy of the mandate of heaven. It reframed the legitimacy of the dynasty in moral terms rather than purely military ones, and in doing so, gave it a kind of stability that force alone could not provide. Han Wudi established an imperial academy where students studied the Confucian classics and trained for government service. This was the beginning of what would eventually mature into the imperial examination system, the practice of selecting government officials based on demonstrated intellectual and moral achievement rather than primarily on birth or military connection. As an organizing ideal, regardless of how imperfectly it was realized in practice, this was genuinely remarkable. No other major civilization in the ancient world built its governing class primarily around this principle. Han Wudi also transformed the Han's strategic position. The Han faced along their northern frontier a confederacy of nomadic peoples called the Xiongnu, who had forced the early Han emperors into a tribute arrangement that many at court experienced as a humiliation. Han Wudi ended that arrangement through a series of massive military campaigns that pushed the Xiongnu back from the northern frontier and expanded Han territory deep into Central Asia. This expansion opened the routes that became known as the Silk Road. The Silk Road began not as a trade route, but as a strategic corridor. Han Wudi needed allies in Central Asia against the Xiongnu and sent a diplomat named Zhang Qian westward to find them. Zhang Qian spent more than a decade in Central Asia, was captured and held by the Xiongnu for years, and eventually returned, having failed in his immediate mission, but carrying something more valuable: detailed knowledge of the peoples, states, and geography of a world China had known only through rumor. The routes Zhang Qian mapped became arteries along which silk, spices, glassware, horses, ideas, and eventually religions moved between China and the Mediterranean world. Rome and Han China never established direct diplomatic contact, but Roman glassware found its way to Chinese tombs, and Chinese silk found its way to Roman markets, passed through the hands of dozens of intermediaries across thousands of miles of mountains and desert. The Silk Road was the first time China was genuinely and sustainably connected to the broader world economy. The consequences of that connection, material and intellectual, and eventually religious, would shape Chinese civilization for centuries. Han Wudi's China also produced its greatest historian, Sima Qian, whose records of the grand historian we encountered earlier, wrote a comprehensive history of China from the legendary Yellow Emperor to his own time that established the model for every official history written in China for the next 2,000 years. He wrote substantial portions while serving a prison sentence. Having accepted castration as an alternative to death after being punished for defending a general who had surrendered to the Xiongnu, he accepted that punishment because he was determined to finish his history and believed completing it mattered more than escaping personal humiliation. That story is itself a statement about what Han civilization valued. The past mattered. Recording it accurately was a moral obligation. History was not decoration or entertainment. It was the foundation on which a civilization understood itself and navigated its future. The Han Dynasty lasted, with one significant interruption, approximately 400 years, 4 centuries of relative political stability, economic recovery, cultural development, and territorial expansion. Long enough for the people of the empire to begin thinking of themselves not just as subjects of the Han Dynasty, but as Han people. Long enough for a genuine cultural identity to form around shared language, shared texts, shared philosophical commitments, and shared ways of organizing family life and understanding the relationship between the individual and the community. That identity proved more durable than the dynasty that created it. When the Han fell in the chaos of the late 2nd and early 3rd century CE, ripped apart by court factionalism, economic crisis, epidemic disease, peasant rebellion, and regional commanders who used their military power to carve out independent domains. The political structure disappeared within years. But the people who had been Han's subjects did not stop being Han people. They kept the language. They kept the texts. They kept the philosophical traditions. They kept the memory of what a unified Chinese civilization had looked like and the conviction that it was something worth rebuilding. Today, the largest ethnic group in China calls itself the Han people. The Chinese writing system is described as Han characters. The Chinese language is called the Han language in formal contexts. A dynasty that ended nearly 2,000 years ago gave its name to an entire civilization's sense of itself. No other dynasty in Chinese history achieved this. Very few dynasties in all of world history have left an inheritance of comparable depth. The Han did not simply rule China. They defined what China was. And when that definition was challenged, as it would be again and again across the centuries that followed, it was the Han inheritance, the language, the texts, the philosophy, the memory of shared civilization that people reached for when they needed to remember what they were trying to rebuild. That is what political legitimacy looks like when it reaches its deepest and most durable form. Not armies, not institution, not even laws. A name that 1 billion people still carry. Chapter 8. 3 Kingdoms to Sui, 4 Centuries of Fracture. In the year 220 CE, the last Han emperor, Liu Xie, formally abdicated the throne. He did not choose to do this. He had no real choice. The men around him had already made the decision. The Han Dynasty was over in every way that mattered long before the paperwork confirmed it. But here is the question that matters more than the date. When the political structure that had held China together for 400 years collapsed, what happened to China itself? The answer to that question is the answer to the spine question running through this entire documentary. And to find it, we have to go into the most complicated, most painful, and most misunderstood period in Chinese history. The final decades of the Han had been a cascade of compounding failures. Court factions fought for control of the imperial administration with an intensity that left actual governance as an afterthought. A massive peasant uprising known as the Yellow Turban Rebellion, driven by genuine economic desperation and a millenarian religious movement promising cosmic transformation, shook the empire's foundations in 184 CE. Regional military commanders raised armies to suppress the rebellion and then discovered that those armies gave them power the central government could no longer challenge. Three major power centers emerged from the wreckage. Wei in the north, controlled by the strategist and warlord Cao Cao, and then his son. Shu Han in the southwest, led by Liu Bei, a man who claimed descent from the Han imperial family and staked his entire identity on restoring Han legitimacy. Wu in the southeast, built by the Sun family along the Yangtze River Valley. These three states gave this period its name, the Three Kingdoms. Now here is the detail that makes the Three Kingdoms period more than a list of battles and dynasties. Liu Bei had a strategist named Zhuge Liang. Zhuge Liang was, by the accounts of his own time and the judgment of every subsequent generation of Chinese historians, one of the most gifted minds in Chinese history. As a military strategist, a political administrator, an inventor, and a writer, he operated at a level that made contemporaries describe him in terms usually reserved for the legendary figures of antiquity. He served Liu Bei with a loyalty so absolute and so publicly demonstrated that it became, in Chinese cultural memory, the defining example of what righteous service to a worthy cause actually looked like. And he failed. Not for lack of ability, not for lack of effort. Zhuge Liang spent the final years of his life leading a series of military campaigns from the southwestern state of Shuhan into the northern territory controlled by Wei, attempting to reunify China under the banner of Han legitimacy. He died on campaign in 234 CE, worn down by years of extraordinary effort. Having never achieved the reunification he had dedicated his life to. Why does this matter? Because the story of Zhuge Liang is the story that Chinese civilization told itself about the Three Kingdoms period for the next 1800 years. Not the story of the winner. Not the story of the state that eventually achieved reunification. The story of the man who served the right cause with everything he had and still could not make it work. This says something profound about what Chinese civilization valued and what it chose to remember. The Romance of the Three Kingdoms, written more than 1,000 years after the events it describes, transformed this period into the most beloved work of historical fiction in Chinese history. It is still read today. Its characters are still invoked in business strategy books and political commentary. Zhuge Liang's name is still used in Chinese as shorthand for tactical genius combined with absolute integrity. A period of catastrophe, of wars that killed millions and reduced the population of the North by estimates ranging from 30 to over 50%, depending on region and methodology, was remembered primarily as a test of character, as a crucible that revealed what people were made of when everything was falling apart. That transformation of catastrophe into moral narrative is itself one of the most important things to understand about Chinese civilization. It is how a people survive the unsurvivable, not by pretending the catastrophe did not happen, by finding in it a story worth telling to their children. The Three Kingdoms ended in 280 CE, when the Qin dynasty briefly reunified China. The reunification lasted less than 40 years before collapsing into a civil war among the imperial family that weakened the Qin so severely that nomadic peoples from the northern frontier invaded, captured the Qin capital, and ended Han Chinese political dominance of the north. What followed was one of the most complex periods in all of Chinese history. Historians call it the period of the northern and southern dynasties. For roughly 3.5 centuries, from the early 300s to 589 CE, China was divided between a succession of dynasties in the north, most of them founded by non-Han peoples from the steppes, and a succession of dynasties in the south, established by Han Chinese aristocrats who had fled the northern invasions and rebuilt their political culture in the Yangtze River Valley. The north was contested repeatedly. Different peoples established kingdoms that rose and fell with dizzying speed. The south preserved a form of Han Chinese culture and political tradition, but it was a culture in exile, conscious of what had been lost, shaped by the particular anxiety of a civilization displaced from its heartland. Now comes the question that cuts to the center of everything. For nearly 4 centuries, there was no unified China. The political entity that the Qing had created and the Han had sustained and defined did not exist. The territory was fragmented among competing states. Many of those states were governed by rulers who were not Han Chinese and who came from traditions substantially different from the Confucian political culture the Han had established. So, what held Chinese civilization together during those 4 centuries? Because something did. When the Sui dynasty finally reunified China in 589 CE, it did not reunify a collection of entirely different civilizations that happened to share a geography. It reunified something that still recognized itself as Chinese, something that had preserved, across 4 centuries of political fragmentation, enough shared identity to make reunification feel like restoration rather than conquest. 3 things held it together. The first was writing. The standardized written language that the first emperor had imposed and the Han had sustained did not disappear during the period of division. It remained the common medium of administration, literature, philosophy, and historical record across every state in both North and South. In a world where spoken languages and dialects varied enormously across regions, the shared written language created a community of literate people that transcended every political border. The written language was the thread of common civilization that no military division could cut. The second was the Confucian intellectual tradition. Even in northern states, governed by non-Han rulers, Confucian philosophy remained the framework for discussing legitimate governance. Non-Han rulers who wanted to govern effectively over predominantly Han populations needed Han officials. Han officials brought Confucian assumptions about how government worked and what made it legitimate. Over time, many non-Han rulers adopted Confucian ritual practices, recruited Confucian scholars into their courts, and framed their own legitimacy in Confucian political terms. The most striking example is the Northern Wei dynasty, founded by the Xianbei people, whose Emperor Wen, in the late 400s, launched a deliberate program of cultural transformation. He required the adoption of Han surnames, Han clothing, and the Han language at court. He restructured the court around Confucian ritual and administrative principles. He was not abandoning his own heritage under pressure. He was making a calculated choice that governing China effectively required engaging deeply with Chinese cultural and institutional frameworks. This pattern, the conqueror adopting the cultural framework of the conquered as the price of effective rule, is one of the most persistent and important patterns in all of Chinese history. We will see it play out again with even greater force when we reach the Mongol and Manchu periods. The third element holding Chinese civilization together during the period of division is the most unexpected: Buddhism. Buddhism entered China from Central Asia along Silk Road routes during the Han period, but it became a major cultural force precisely during the period of division. In a world where the old political certainties had collapsed and the Confucian promise of harmonious social order seemed hollow against the evidence of endless violence, Buddhism offered something neither Confucianism nor Taoism quite provided: a systematic account of why suffering existed and a path toward transcending it. Buddhism spread across both north and south. Great monasteries were built. Buddhist art, drawing on Central Asian and Indian traditions, but rapidly developing distinctly Chinese characteristics, flourished across the divided landscape. The translation of Buddhist texts from Sanskrit into Chinese became a major intellectual enterprise that engaged some of the finest minds of the period for generations. Buddhism did not replace Confucianism or Taoism. What happened was more interesting. The three traditions began to coexist, interpenetrate, and influence each other in ways that eventually produced a distinctly Chinese cultural synthesis. Confucianism governed the public world of politics, family obligation, and social hierarchy. Taoism offered a private counterbalance, a philosophy of personal withdrawal and naturalness. Buddhism provided a framework for understanding suffering, death, and the ultimate questions that neither of the other traditions fully addressed. This three-way synthesis, sometimes called the Three Teachings, became the cultural foundation of Chinese civilization from the Tang Dynasty onward. It is one of the most sophisticated examples of philosophical pluralism in human history. A civilization that did not demand its people choose a single ultimate truth, but allowed different frameworks to answer different kinds of questions without demanding they be reconciled into a single system. The period of division ended with the Sui dynasty, which reunified China in 589 CE for the first time in nearly 4 centuries. The Sui lasted only 37 years. Like the Qin before it, it unified and exhausted itself simultaneously. It built the Grand Canal connecting the Yellow River and the Yangtze, creating an internal waterway network that would sustain Chinese commerce for the next 14 centuries. But failed military campaigns and excessive demands on the population produced rebellions that ended the dynasty within a generation. Also like the Qing, the Sui created the platform that the dynasty following it would build into something extraordinary. 4 centuries of fracture had not broken China. They had, in a way that only becomes visible in retrospect, deepened it. The shared language, the philosophical tradition, and the memory of what unified Chinese civilization had meant were all still there when the political conditions for rebuilding arrived. That persistence is not accidental. It is the beginning of the answer to the question. Chapter 9. Tang, the Golden Age that wasn't purely Chinese. There is a woman at the center of the Tang Dynasty's story who does not appear in most popular histories of this period until the very end. Mentioned briefly as a curiosity or a cautionary tale before the narrative moves on. She deserves to be at the center. Her name was Wu Zetian, and understanding her story, what she achieved, and how later Chinese historiography worked very hard to contain her memory afterward, tells us more about the Tang Dynasty than almost anything else we could examine. But to understand why her story matters so much, we first need to understand the world she rose through. The Tang Dynasty, which ruled from 618 to 907 CE, is the dynasty most commonly invoked when Chinese people want to describe China at its greatest. Tang poetry is the standard against which all later Chinese poetry is measured. Tang Buddhist sculpture is among the finest religious art produced anywhere in Asia. The Tang capital of Chang'an, located near modern Xi'an, was at its height one of the largest cities on earth, home by some historical estimates to close to 1 million people at a time when no city in Europe came close to that scale. But the Tang imperial family was not purely Han Chinese in its background. The founder of the Tang, a military commander named Li Yuan, who had served the Sui dynasty before leading the rebellion that toppled it. Came from a family with mixed ancestry that included Xianbei heritage on his mother's side. The culture of the early Tang court was shaped as much by the 3 centuries of non-Han rule in the north as by the Confucian Han traditions that preceded them. Tang emperors hunted on horseback and played polo, a sport that arrived from Central Asia. They wore clothing influenced by Central Asian fashion. The Tang military relied heavily on non-Han cavalry commanders. The capital Chang'an housed Persian merchants, Arab traders, Nestorian Christians, Zoroastrians, Koreans, and Japanese, all living and worshiping and conducting business in a city that genuinely welcomed their presence. This cosmopolitanism was not decoration. It was a reflection of genuine Tang engagement with a broader world. The Silk Road, which had contracted during the period of division, reopened under the Tang with greater activity than ever before. Tang China exported silk and ceramics westward and imported horses, glassware, cotton, and musical instruments eastward. The monk Xuanzang, whose roughly 16 to 18-year journey to India to collect Buddhist texts inspired the later novel Journey to the West, brought back hundreds of Sanskrit manuscripts that he spent the rest of his life translating, deepening Chinese Buddhism while maintaining its connections to its Indian origins. The Tang period also saw the full flowering of the imperial examination system. Passing the most prestigious examination, called the Jinshi degree, became the primary pathway to high government office. The examinations were genuinely demanding, requiring years of intensive study of classical texts, history, philosophy, and literary composition. Passing rates in a given year were typically low, often under 10% of candidates. The system was not perfectly meritocratic. Wealthy families could afford the years of tutoring that poor families could not. Connections mattered in practice, but the principle it embodied, that demonstrated intellectual achievement rather than birth alone should determine who governed, was a genuine civilizational achievement with no real parallel elsewhere in the ancient world. Tang poetry deserves its own moment because it represents something that cannot be reduced to political or economic history. Du Fu wrote about the suffering of ordinary people during the Great Rebellion of his time with a directness and compassion that still reads as immediate across 1400 years. Li Bai wrote about moonlight and wine and friendship and the beautiful transience of everything with an effortlessness that later poets spent entire careers trying to approach. Wang Wei wrote poems that dissolved the boundary between the human world and the natural world so completely that the reader cannot tell where one ends and the other begins. These were not court entertainments. They were expressions of a civilization's deepest engagement with the questions of how to live, what beauty is, and what it means to be human in a world that is always changing and always ending. The fact that these poems are still memorized, still quoted in daily conversation, still felt as living rather than historical in China today, is evidence of a connection between present and past more than 12 centuries deep. Now we return to Wu Zetian. Wu Zetian entered the Tang court as a concubine of the Emperor Taizong when she was around 14 years old. After Taizong's death, she was sent, following palace convention, to a Buddhist convent to spend the remainder of her life as a nun. This was the normal fate of imperial concubines who had not produced heirs when their emperor died. Wu Zetian did not accept that fate. Through a combination of intelligence, political skill, and the cultivation of relationships within the court, she found her way back. She became the favorite of the new Emperor Gaozong, married him after his first empress was deposed, and gradually took on increasing political responsibility as Gaozong's health declined. By the time Gaozong died, she was effectively governing the empire. She served as regent for 2 of her sons after Gaozong's death, deposing both when they failed to cooperate with her governance. And in 690 CE, she did something that no woman had ever done in Chinese history, and no woman would do again. She declared herself emperor, not empress consort, not regent, emperor, the supreme ruler of China in her own right. She founded her own dynasty, which she called the Zhou, and ruled for 15 years. Evaluate her governance by the actual measures of governance, and the record is substantively strong. She expanded the examination system and promoted officials on demonstrated merit. She pursued effective military and diplomatic policies. She maintained imperial stability during a period when instability would have been easy to produce. Officials who evaluated her on policy, rather than on the question of whether a woman should hold this position at all, had relatively little to criticize. But the Confucian system of relationships had no framework for a female emperor. The entire logic of dynastic succession assumed male rulers. Wu Zetian's existence as emperor was a living challenge to assumptions so foundational that most people had never needed to examine them consciously. The response was sustained and deliberate. Later Chinese historiography worked very hard to contain her memory, reframing her legacy in terms that rendered her aberrant and monstrous rather than capable and legitimate. Stories multiplied about her cruelty, her ruthlessness, her willingness to destroy anyone who posed a threat. Her 15 years of rule were characterized not as governance, but as usurpation of the natural order. Some of these characterizations may have contained elements of truth. Political figures who hold power through uncertain means sometimes do operate ruthlessly. But the historical record about Wu Zetian was written almost entirely by men with strong ideological motivations to portray a female emperor as a catastrophe rather than a capable ruler. Separating the accurate from the tendentious remains one of the genuine challenges in Tang historiography. What is not seriously disputed is this: Wu Zetian governed one of the largest and most complex states on earth for roughly 4 decades, if you count the full period of her effective power. She did so with sufficient competence that the empire she returned to the Tang imperial family in 705 CE was intact, functional, and in many respects stronger than when she took control. The erasure of Wu Zetian is not just the story of one woman. It is the story of what Chinese civilization, for all its extraordinary depth and flexibility, could not accommodate within its existing frameworks. Every civilization has its blind spots. The Tang's most revealing blind spot was the one it worked hardest, across centuries, to cover up. The Tang Golden Age was real. The poetry was real. The cosmopolitan energy was real. The examination system was real. The cultural achievements were real, and their reach extends to us still. But a golden age built on the deliberate reframing of its most consequential female ruler carries within it a contradiction that its admirers would prefer not to examine too closely. The An Lushan Rebellion, which began in 755 CE, exposed another set of contradictions. An Lushan was a military commander of Sogdian and Turkic ancestry who governed a large northeastern territory and commanded substantial forces. His rebellion became a catastrophic civil war that lasted nearly 8 years and caused devastation across northern China on a scale that reduced the population of some regions dramatically. Historical estimates of the toll vary widely and must be treated as approximations. But the scale of the destruction was, by any measure, enormous. The Tang survived only with the help of foreign armies. including Uyghur forces whose assistance came at significant political and material cost. The dynasty that emerged was permanently weakened. Regional military governors, whose power the rebellion had exposed, never fully returned to the subordinate position the civil bureaucracy had previously maintained. The cosmopolitan confidence of early Tang gave way to a more anxious and inward political culture. The dynasty continued for another century and a half before finally collapsing in 907 CE, ending in a period of fragmentation called the Five Dynasties and 10 Kingdoms, where 5 dynasties rose and fell in the north in the span of 53 years, while regional kingdoms maintained independent power in the south. Golden ages are always built by people who had no idea they were living in one, and they always contain within them the contradictions that their successors spend generations trying to resolve. The Tang ended. The fragmentation that followed was brief by the standards of Chinese history, and from that fragmentation emerged a dynasty that would prove, in the most counterintuitive way possible, that military weakness and civilizational greatness were not the contradictions they appeared to be. Chapter 10. Song, the dynasty that lost half its territory and still changed the world. In 960 CE, a military commander named Zhou was acclaimed emperor by his troops in a coup that was, by the violent standards of the Five Dynasties period, remarkably restrained. He founded the Song dynasty, reunified most of China within 20 years, and then did something no founder of a major Chinese dynasty had done before him with such deliberate and sustained consistency. He systematically dismantled the military power of the class of people who had made and broken dynasties for the previous century. Zhou Kuangyin, known to history by his temple name Taizu, understood that the fragmentation of the Tang and the chaos of the Five Dynasties had been driven by regional military commanders who had accumulated enough independent power to ignore or overthrow central authority whenever it suited them. His solution was elegant and bloodless. He invited his most powerful generals to a banquet, acknowledged their years of loyal service with genuine warmth, and made clear that their comfortable and honored retirement would begin immediately. The generals understood the message. They retired. Their armies were absorbed into a centralized imperial military, commanded by officers who served at the emperor's pleasure and rotated regularly to prevent any commander from building the kind of personal loyalty that could become political independence. The result was an empire in which civilian officials exercised genuine authority over military affairs for the first time since the early Han. The examination system expanded dramatically. Governance became more document-driven, more reliant on the kind of educated administrator that years of classical study produced. And the Song military, commanded by rotating officers under civilian supervision, proved consistently outmatched against the nomadic and semi-nomadic peoples along China's northern and northwestern frontiers. This is the central paradox of the Song dynasty. The most civilian, most commercially sophisticated, most intellectually productive dynasty in Chinese history was also the most militarily vulnerable. From the beginning, the Song faced the Liao dynasty in the northeast, established by the Khitan people, which held significant northern territories. The Song made peace with the Liao through a treaty in 1005 CE that required annual payments of silver and silk in exchange for peace. By traditional Chinese political standards, the Emperor of China paying tribute to a foreign power was a humiliation without precedent. Then, in 1127 CE, the Jurchen Jin dynasty captured the Song capital of Kaifeng and took the reigning emperor and his father prisoner, ending what historians call the Northern Song. The surviving Song court fled south, established a new capital at Linan, modern Hangzhou, and continued ruling the southern half of China as the Southern Song for another 150 years. By every conventional measure of imperial success, the Song were failures. They lost territory. They paid tribute. Their emperors were captured and held in foreign captivity. And yet, to understand what the Song actually were, meet a man named Su Shi, known by his literary name Su Dongpo. He was a poet, painter, calligrapher, gastronomer, government official, and engineer who lived from 1037 to 1101 CE and is widely considered one of the greatest creative minds in Chinese history. Su Dongpo spent much of his career being exiled. He held views on governance that kept putting him on the wrong side of court factional struggles. And so he spent years at a time in remote postings far from the capital, in places that a less curious and less resilient man would have experienced as pure punishment. Instead, he wrote some of the most celebrated poetry in the Chinese tradition. He developed techniques in Chinese cuisine, including a braised pork dish still served today that carries his name. He studied local hydrology and organized the construction of flood control works that protected hundreds of thousands of people. He wrote philosophical essays of enduring influence. He practiced calligraphy in styles that later masters spent generations studying. What Su Dongpo represents is not just an exceptional individual. He represents what the Song system, with its expanded examination culture, its commercial prosperity, and its genuine, if imperfect, commitment to promoting talented people through demonstrated achievement, was capable of producing in human terms. A civilization that could generate a Su Dongpo and generate him not as a rare freak of nature, but as one example among many of a literate, curious, creative class of people engaged with the world at every level, was doing something that military victories and territorial control do not fully measure. The Song period produced economic and technological transformation that specialists have carefully compared to aspects of the later Industrial Revolution in Europe, with the important caveat that such comparisons involve genuine methodological complexity and should be understood as suggestive rather than precisely quantified. Agricultural productivity increased dramatically through the adoption of faster ripening rice varieties from Vietnam that allowed double harvests per year across much of the South. Iron production expanded significantly, with coal being used as fuel for ironworks in ways that would not become widespread in Europe for centuries. The ceramics industry produced porcelain of such consistently high quality that the English language eventually used the name of the country as the common noun for fine ceramics. Paper money was invented in Song China. The practical logic was straightforward. Carrying enough copper coins to conduct large commercial transactions was physically impractical for merchants operating at significant scale. Private deposit certificates developed organically before the government recognized both the convenience and the revenue potential, and began issuing official paper currency. This was the first government-issued paper money in human history. Printing technology advanced significantly during the Song period. Movable type using ceramic components was developed by a craftsman named Bi Sheng. We know of Bi Sheng's work primarily through the writing of the scholar Shen Kuo, who documented it roughly a century after the fact. The practical application of movable type in China was complicated by the nature of the Chinese writing system, which uses thousands of distinct characters rather than the small alphabet sets that would make Gutenberg's later metal movable type so transformative in Europe. The Song printing industry nonetheless produced books in quantities that expanded literacy substantially beyond anything previous centuries had achieved. The magnetic compass was refined during the Song period into a reliable navigation instrument. Gunpowder, known in China since the Tang period, was developed into actual weapons, fire arrows, bombs, and early firearms appear in Song military records. The first military application of a technology that would eventually transform warfare everywhere on Earth. What does this add up to? A civilization generating extraordinary economic and technological innovation precisely during the period when its political and military situation was most precarious. And that pattern forces a question without a comfortable answer. Was the Song's civilian orientation a weakness that left it vulnerable, or a different kind of strength that produced a different kind of achievement? The honest answer is both. The Song model produced genuine civilizational achievements of lasting consequence. It also produced a state that could not defend itself against enemies who prioritized military power above everything else. Military priority won the immediate contest. The Southern Song held out against the Mongols for 45 years. This was not a swift collapse. The Song had the population, the naval technology, the economic resources, and the institutional coherence to resist the most powerful military force in the world for nearly half a century. The final Song resistance ended in 1279 CE at a naval battle off the southern coast. A dynasty that could never hold its northern frontier held off the Mongol military machine for 45 years. That is also a measure of what the Song had built. Chapter 11. For the Mongol century, when China was conquered and conquered its conquerors, in 1279 CE, for the first time in its history, all of China was under the control of a foreign power. This was not the partial northern conquest that the Liao and Jin had achieved. This was complete. Every part of what had constituted the Chinese world was under Mongol control. The Yuan dynasty, as Kublai Khan named his Chinese empire, was the Chinese portion of the largest contiguous land empire in history, extending from the Pacific coast to the edges of Eastern Europe. The scale of the Mongol conquests is genuinely difficult to absorb even with historical distance. The campaigns that created this empire killed tens of millions of people across Asia and Europe, a number representing a significant fraction of the global population of the time. Cities that resisted were destroyed, with a thoroughness designed to make resistance seem futile to the next city. Agricultural landscapes were, in some regions, converted to pasture to support the nomadic economy the Mongols understood and preferred. China suffered enormously. The north had already been devastated by decades of conflict before the southern conquest. Population estimates for China before and after the conquest period showed dramatic declines that took generations to recover from. Kublai Khan ruled this landscape and faced the same problem every conqueror of China had faced before him. China was too large, too complex, too administratively sophisticated, and too culturally coherent to be governed the way the Mongols governed the steppe. You could conquer China on horseback. You could not administer it on horseback. To collect taxes from 100 million farmers across the complex river systems of South and North, you needed a bureaucracy. You needed written records. You needed officials who understood local languages, local agricultural cycles, and the endless disputes over water rights and land and inheritance that agricultural societies generate constantly. You needed, in short, something that looked very much like the Chinese administrative system that had been developing and refining itself since the Qin dynasty. 15 centuries before the Mongols arrived. Kublai Khan understood this with unusual clarity for a conqueror. He established his capital at what is now Beijing, in a city drawing on both Mongol and Chinese traditions. He employed Chinese officials alongside Mongols and Central Asians. He patronized Chinese arts and scholarship. He maintained the examination system, though with modifications that altered the relative advantage of Han Chinese candidates. The Yuan dynasty maintained a clear ethnic hierarchy. Mongols at the top, Central Asians and other non-Chinese peoples second, Northern Chinese third, Southern Chinese, whose territory had been conquered last and whose resistance had been longest, fourth. This hierarchy was written into law in ways that affected legal rights and official appointments. China did not simply absorb its conquerors overnight. The process was long, contested, and incomplete. Mongol identity did not dissolve during the Yuan period. The ethnic hierarchy never fully broke down. But here is what actually happened over time. The longer Mongol rulers governed China, the more deeply they were drawn into Chinese cultural and institutional frameworks. Kublai performed Chinese imperial rituals. He accepted the Confucian framework of legitimate rule, at least in its outward forms. He presented himself to his Chinese subjects not primarily as a steppe conqueror, but as the holder of the mandate of heaven. Later Yuan emperors were educated in Chinese classical texts. The court became increasingly Chinese in its cultural orientation, even as it maintained the formal ethnic hierarchy. The institutions, rituals, language of rule, an idea of what an emperor was and what an emperor owed the people he governed, reshaped the conquerors over time. Not completely, not without resistance, but persistently and in one direction. The Yuan period also transformed China's connection to the wider world in ways with permanent consequences. The Mongol Empire produced something genuinely new, a connected Eurasian world in which goods, people, and ideas moved with greater speed and freedom than had ever been possible before. The relative security that Mongol dominance enforced across the Silk Road routes enabled long-distance travel and trade on a scale that astounded contemporaries. A Venetian merchant named Marco Polo claimed to have spent years in the service of Kublai Khan and dictated an account of his experiences that introduced millions of Europeans to a civilization whose sophistication and wealth surpassed anything they had previously imagined. Historians continue to debate exactly how much of Marco Polo's account reflects direct personal experience versus information gathered from other sources. And the debate is unlikely to be fully resolved with available evidence. What the account conveyed about the scale and complexity of Yuan China reflected the reality of what was there. The Yuan period also saw bubonic plague travel along the same Silk Road networks that carried silk and spices. The disease that devastated Europe in the 1300s as the Black Death had already killed enormous numbers in China and Central Asia before it reached the Mediterranean world. The demographic catastrophe it contributed to, layered on top of the losses from conquest, left parts of China severely underpopulated for generations. The Yuan dynasty lasted less than a century in China. By the 1340s and 1350s, it was visibly failing. The Yellow River flooded catastrophically and shifted course, destroying agricultural land and displacing millions of people. Famine followed. Rebellions spread across the empire, many organized around religious movements, promising cosmic transformation and the restoration of Han Chinese rule. One of these rebellions was led by a man whose background was even more improbable than Liu Bang's 1200 years before him. Zhou Yuanzhang was born into desperate poverty in the Huai River Valley. He lost most of his immediate family to plague and famine when he was a teenager, survived for a time by begging at a Buddhist monastery. joined a rebel army in his mid-20s, and rose through its ranks with extraordinary speed. By his late 30s, he had become the dominant military power in southern China. In 1368 CE, his forces captured Beijing and drove the last Yuan emperor north onto the steppe. Zhou Yuanzhang declared himself the founder of the Ming dynasty. The Mongol century was over. What it had demonstrated, for anyone willing to see it clearly, was the central pattern of Chinese civilization's survival. The cultural complexity of Chinese civilization, its written language, its philosophical traditions, its administrative systems, its accumulated institutional knowledge, was heavier than any army. Conquerors who wanted to govern what they had conquered had to engage with that complexity, and engaging with it over time and under the pressure of actual governance meant being shaped by it. The weight of Chinese civilization was heavier than the weight of the Mongol cavalry. It would prove heavier than the next conquerors too. Chapter 12. Ming, the dynasty that looked inward. Zhou Yuanzhang was perhaps the most improbable emperor in Chinese history. A man who had begged for food at monastery gates as a teenager now sat on the dragon throne and faced the task of rebuilding a civilization that had survived a century of Mongol rule, decades of civil war, and demographic catastrophe that had left entire regions of China nearly empty. He ruled as the Hongwu Emperor, and he ruled with the intensity of a man who had seen everything that could go wrong and was determined through sheer personal force to prevent it from going wrong again. His governance reflected both the extraordinary energy of his origins and the deep anxieties they had produced. He worked with a ferocity that astonished his court, reportedly reviewing hundreds of documents and making thousands of decisions personally every single day. He abolished the position of prime minister entirely after executing the man who held it on charges of treason, concentrating all executive authority in the emperor's hands in a way no previous dynasty had attempted at this scale. He was also, by the records that survive, extraordinarily brutal toward anyone he perceived as a threat. Purges of officials accused of corruption or disloyalty killed tens of thousands of people during his reign, including their extended families and associates. Yet, alongside this ruthlessness, he rebuilt. He reorganized agricultural land, restored irrigation systems, reduced taxes on the peasantry, and created village-level governance structures that gave ordinary rural communities a degree of local autonomy rarely seen under previous dynasties. He was a man of profound contradictions, which made him an entirely appropriate founder for a dynasty that would be defined by profound contradictions across nearly 3 centuries. The Ming Dynasty, ruling from 1368 to 1644 CE, is often remembered in the West primarily for 2 things: the Great Wall in its most recognizable form, and the voyages of Zhang He. Both memories capture something real. Both also obscure something important. The Great Wall that most people picture when they think of China, the dramatic stone fortification running along mountain ridges in Hebei province, is almost entirely a Ming construction. Earlier walls existed but were built primarily from tamped earth and have largely eroded. The Ming rebuilt and extended the wall in stone and brick on a massive scale across more than a century of construction. In response to persistent military threats from Mongol successor states on the northern frontier, what it represented symbolically was the Ming's fundamental orientation defensive, focused on maintaining the civilization within its known borders rather than projecting power beyond them. That orientation stands in profound contrast to what happened during the early 15th century under the Yongle Emperor. Zhang He, was a Muslim eunuch admiral of Central Asian ancestry who served the Mongol emperor with extraordinary capability. Between 1405 and 1433 CE, he commanded 7 massive naval expeditions across Southeast Asia, India, the Persian Gulf, and the east coast of Africa. His fleet included vessels substantially larger than anything sailing European waters at the same time. Though the precise dimensions recorded in Chinese historical sources have been questioned by some specialists and should be understood as reflecting the general scale of the enterprise rather than precisely verified measurements. His crews numbered in the tens of thousands. The expeditions were primarily diplomatic projections of Ming power and prestige, bringing foreign rulers into the tributary system through which China formalized its relationships with the outside world. Zhang He reached places no Chinese fleet had reached before, and demonstrated that Chinese maritime technology was at that moment among the most advanced on Earth. And then the program stopped. The Mongol emperor died in 1424 CE. Court factions hostile to the expensive maritime enterprise gained influence. Maritime ambition narrowed. Court priorities shifted. And later, imperial policy became increasingly cautious toward the outside world. Records of the voyages were, in some cases, deliberately destroyed by officials who viewed the entire enterprise as a wasteful distraction from the proper business of governing China's agricultural heartland. By the time Portuguese ships appeared in the Indian Ocean at the end of the 15th century, the Chinese maritime presence that had dominated those waters had largely withdrawn. Why did China turn away from maritime expansion at precisely the moment European expansion was beginning? The explanation most commonly offered, that Chinese culture was inherently inward-looking and uninterested in the wider world, is directly contradicted by the Zheng He voyages themselves. A civilization with no interest in the outside world does not build the largest ocean-going fleet in the world and send it to Africa. The better explanation involves specific political dynamics. The examination-trained Confucian bureaucracy consistently prioritized agricultural stability and northern frontier defense over commercial maritime expansion. The maritime program was associated with the eunuch political faction that the bureaucracy opposed on both policy and principle. The decision was made by specific people in specific political circumstances for reasons that seemed locally rational at the time. The consequences of that decision took centuries to fully manifest. As the Ming entered its 2nd and 3rd centuries, the dynasty began showing the structural weaknesses of a system that concentrated too much authority in the emperor personally and built too few resilient institutions that could function independently of imperial engagement. The contrasts were sometimes stark. The Xuande emperor, who ruled in the 1420s and 30s, was an accomplished painter, calligrapher, and cricket enthusiast who governed with relative competence. But later emperors retreated further from active governance. The Wanli emperor, who ruled from 1572 to 1620 CE, famously refused to attend court sessions or meet with officials for stretches lasting years at a time. He spent decades in a standoff with his bureaucracy over the question of which of his sons should be designated heir. While the emperor sulked and the bureaucracy argued, the northeastern frontier was changing in ways that would eventually prove fatal. A man named Nurhaci was unifying the Jurchen peoples of the northeast. Related to the Jurchen who had founded the Jin dynasty 4 centuries earlier, he created a military system of extraordinary effectiveness called the 8 Banners and built a state capable of challenging Ming power on the frontier. His son Hong Taiji continued the process of state building, drawing on both Jurchen traditions and Chinese governance models with careful deliberation. Hong Taiji renamed his people the Manchu and his dynasty, the Qing. They were preparing to do what no northern people had managed since the Mongols conquered all of China. But they needed the Ming to help them by destroying itself first. The Little Ice Age, a period of global cooling that reduced agricultural yields across the northern hemisphere, hit northern China with particular severity in the early 17th century. Harvest failures drove peasant rebellions across the interior. A rebel leader named Li Zicheng built an army from the displaced and desperate that swept across northern China with remarkable speed. In 1644 CE, his forces captured Beijing, the last Ming emperor, rather than face capture, hanged himself on a hill behind the Forbidden City. The Ming was gone, but Li Zicheng did not inherit China. A Ming general named Wu Sangui, commanding the northeastern passes against the Manchu, made the decision to open the gates and invite the Manchu armies in to help defeat Li Zicheng and restore order. It was a tactical calculation that made sense in the immediate moment. It was, in retrospect, the end of Han Chinese rule of China for the next 2.5 centuries. The Manchu forces swept through, defeated Li Zicheng, and claimed China for themselves. The Qing dynasty had arrived. Chapter 13. Qing, the Last Empire and the Long Goodbye. The conquest of southern China took another generation of fighting. Ming loyalist resistance was fierce and sustained. The order requiring all Han Chinese men to adopt the Manchu Q hairstyle on pain of death was experienced as a profound cultural humiliation and generated resistance that cost enormous lives before compliance was enforced across the empire. And yet the pattern held. The same pattern that had played out with the Northern Way, with the Jin, with the Yuan, the conqueror, to govern what they had conquered, had to become part of it. The Qing emperors who built the dynasty's mature power did not simply sit atop Chinese civilization. They entered it, studied it, and governed from within it with a sophistication that earned the respect even of those who resented their conquest. The Kangxi Emperor, who ruled for 61 years from 1661 to 1722 CE, is by many measures the most impressive ruler in the last 5 centuries of Chinese history. He mastered the Chinese classical tradition with genuine depth, studying with leading scholars and engaging in intellectual correspondence that ranged from Chinese poetry to Western mathematics and astronomy. He supervised the compilation of an official Ming history, a comprehensive dictionary of Chinese characters that remained a standard reference for generations, and an enormous encyclopedia of classical literature. He conducted personal inspection tours of the empire's flood control systems in the tradition of Yu the Great himself, connecting his rule to the oldest thread of Chinese political legitimacy. He suppressed the Three Feudatories' rebellion that threatened to fragment the empire in its early decades and incorporated Taiwan into the empire for the first time. He ruled for 61 years and died having never been defeated in a major military campaign. The Yongzheng Emperor, who ruled from 1722 to 1735 CE, was less celebrated, but in some respects more consequential for the dynasty's stability. He reformed the fiscal system with an efficiency that substantially increased government revenues while reducing the burden on ordinary taxpayers. He strengthened the mechanisms for selecting and evaluating officials. He worked with a personal intensity that matched the Hongwu emperors, reportedly sleeping only 4 hours a night to attend to the business of governing the largest empire on earth. The Qianlong Emperor, who ruled from 1735 to 1796 CE, presided over the dynasty's greatest territorial expansion, Tibet, Xinjiang, and Mongolia were incorporated into the empire through a combination of military campaigns, diplomatic marriages, and the careful management of diverse peoples that a multi-ethnic empire requires. He personally composed an extraordinary quantity of poetry in the Chinese classical tradition, a reflection of genuine engagement with Chinese literary culture. At the height of his reign, the Qing Empire was one of the largest, most populous, and most prosperous states on earth. Consider what these three reigns represent together. More than 130 years of capable, sustained governance, more than a century during which China's population grew dramatically. Agricultural production expanded, commerce flourished, and the territory under Chinese imperial control reached its historical maximum. By many measures of historical economic analysis, China in the 18th century represented one of the largest economies in the world. And then came the 19th century. The contrast between the Qing at its height and the Qing in its decline is one of the most dramatic reversals in the history of any civilization. Understanding why that reversal happened requires understanding something that the Qing, for all its sophistication, had not prepared for. Every challenge China had faced before, every conqueror, every period of fragmentation, every dynastic collapse, had come from within the world that Chinese civilization knew. From the steppe to the north, from the Yangtze Valley to the south, from the mountains and deserts at its edges. The Qing had adapted to all of these challenges because they were variations on patterns Chinese civilization had encountered before. The challenge that arrived from the sea in the 19th century was not a variation on a known pattern. It was an industrial civilization whose military technology, organizational systems, and economic power had developed along trajectories entirely outside the experience of Chinese history, and which had reached a level of material capability that no amount of Confucian learning or examination system governance could directly address. The Opium Wars, beginning in 1839 CE, made this gap visible in the most painful way possible. The Qing government had been attempting to enforce its own laws against the opium trade that British merchants were conducting with substantial profit and, as acknowledged even by some contemporary British observers, at enormous cost to Chinese society through widespread addiction and social disruption. The British military response to the seizure of merchant opium demonstrated that the gap between Qing military capability and British industrial military power was not a matter of tactics or strategy. It was structural. The Treaty of Nanking in 1842 CE forced China to cede Hong Kong to Britain, open 5 ports to foreign trade, pay a large financial indemnity, and grant British citizens in China exemption from Chinese law. This last provision, known as extraterritoriality, struck at something fundamental: the sovereign right of a state to govern all people within its territory, a right so foundational that Chinese political culture had never needed to articulate it explicitly, had been negated by military force. The treaties that followed over the next decades, which Chinese historians call the unequal treaties, accumulated into a systematic erosion of Chinese sovereignty. Multiple foreign powers, not just Britain but France, Russia, Germany, the United States, and eventually Japan, each extracted their own concessions through combinations of military pressure and diplomatic leverage. The century that followed was one of the most painful in Chinese history. The Taiping Rebellion, which raged from 1850 to 1864 CE, was driven by a syncretic religious movement that combined Christian missionary teachings with traditional Chinese religious traditions to create a new faith. whose leader, Hong Xiuquan, believed himself to have received a divine mandate to establish a heavenly kingdom on earth. The civil war it generated killed somewhere between 20 and 30 million people by most historical estimates, making it one of the deadliest conflicts in recorded history. It was suppressed only through the combined efforts of Qing forces and foreign-trained and foreign-officered armies. The latter fact itself, a measure of how far the dynasty had fallen from the self-sufficiency of its founding generations. The Boxer Rebellion of 1900 CE, a popular uprising driven by genuine anger at foreign encroachment and the social disruptions of foreign commercial presence, was supported by the Qing court under the Empress Dowager Cixi in a decision that proved catastrophically miscalculated. When the Boxers besieged the foreign legations in Beijing, the eight-nation military coalition that responded occupied the capital, looted the imperial palaces, and imposed a financial indemnity so large that it shaped Qing fiscal policy for the remainder of the dynasty's existence. The humiliation was total. Chinese intellectuals and officials watched all of this with a growing and agonizing awareness that the traditional frameworks could not adequately explain or address what was happening. The question of how to respond divided Chinese thinkers into camps, arguing with increasing urgency. Some argued for selective modernization, adopt Western military technology and industrial methods while preserving the Confucian cultural and political core. Others argued that the Confucian system itself was part of the problem, that China could not modernize effectively while its educated class was still being trained primarily on texts 2,000 years old. Still others argued for more radical transformation, drawing on Western political ideas ranging from constitutional monarchy to republicanism. The abolition of the imperial examination system in 1905 CE ended an institution that had been central to Chinese governance for more than 1,000 years. The system that had embodied the Confucian ideal of merit-based governance, that had served as one of the primary mechanisms through which Chinese cultural identity was transmitted and reproduced across centuries, was gone. 6 years later, in 1912 CE, the last Qing emperor, a 6-year-old boy named Puyi, abdicated the throne. The imperial system that Yangshao had established more than 2,000 years earlier was over. The dragon throne was empty. The mandate of heaven had no one left to claim it. And the question that had been asked and answered and asked again across 5,000 years of this history was being asked with more urgency and less certainty than at any point since before the Zhou dynasty. What are we? And how do we survive what is coming? Chapter 14. Epilogue. The answer to the question. We began with a simple observation. China fell many times, but something called China kept returning. We have now watched that pattern play out across 5,000 years, across the oracle bones of the Shang and the philosophical revolution of the warring states, across the brutal standardization of the Qin and the cultural definition of the Han, across the extraordinary fracture of the Three Kingdoms period and the golden cosmopolitanism of the Tang, across the civilian genius of the Song and the century of Mongol rule, across the inward turn of the Ming and the long, painful twilight of the Qing, across conquest and fragmentation and philosophical reinvention and the slow, agonizing collision with a modernity that arrived from outside the world that Chinese civilization had known. Now it is time to answer the question directly. How does a civilization survive everything that China survived? How does an identity challenged by conquest and fragmentation and foreign rule and internal catastrophe across 5,000 years remain recognizably itself? The answer is not what most people expect. China did not preserve its identity by resisting change. Every attempt to preserve Chinese civilization through pure resistance eventually broke under the pressure of what it was resisting. The Shang resisted the Zhou and fell. The Zhou resisted fragmentation and collapsed. The Qin tried to freeze society through force and lasted 15 years. The Ming increasingly prioritized defensive stability and court-centered control over sustained engagement with the outside world, and was destroyed by a combination of internal failure and external pressure it had not prepared itself to face. The dynasties that endured, the Han, the Tang, the Song in its own way, the Qing at its height, survived not because they held rigidly to a fixed form, but because they absorbed what they needed from the forces pressing against them while maintaining the core of what made them Chinese. What was that core? It was never primarily a political system. Political systems changed dramatically across Chinese history, from the feudal decentralization of the Zhou to the absolute centralization of the Qin, from the cosmopolitan openness of the Tang to the defensive inwardness of the Ming. No single political form defined Chinese civilization across this span. It was never primarily an ethnic identity. The people who called themselves Chinese across these 5,000 years were not a single ethnic group. They were Han and Xianbei and Jurchen and Manchu and dozens of other peoples who became part of the Chinese world through different processes at different times. The ethnic boundaries of Chinese civilization were always more permeable than the official rhetoric of any particular dynasty acknowledged. It was not primarily a religion. Confucianism, Taoism, and Buddhism all contributed essential threads, but none of them alone constituted Chinese civilization. And Chinese civilization held all three simultaneously, without demanding that its people resolve the tensions between them into a single orthodoxy. What defined Chinese civilization across 5,000 years was something more fundamental than any of these: a written language that allowed people separated by vast distances and mutually incomprehensible spoken dialects to share a single intellectual world. A philosophical tradition that kept asking, across every crisis and every reinvention, how human beings should treat each other and what obligations power carries toward the people it governs. A sense of historical memory so deep that it became structural. The conviction that the past mattered, that recording it accurately was a moral responsibility, and that understanding it was necessary for navigating whatever came next. And something harder to name but visible in everything we have examined: a particular kind of cultural patience, the deep, unspoken confidence of a civilization that had survived enough to know it could survive almost anything, because the evidence of that survival was written into the very language and texts and traditions it carried forward. That patience expressed itself most powerfully in the way Chinese civilization treated its conquerors. Not with pure resistance, which rarely worked, not with pure accommodation, which would have dissolved Chinese identity into whatever the conquerors brought, but with something more sophisticated: the patient, persistent demonstration that the Chinese way of organizing a complex society was more effective than the alternatives, and that anyone who wanted to govern China would eventually have to learn it. The northern Wei Shenbei, who transformed their court in the 5th century, the Mongol Yuan, who maintained the examination system and performed Confucian rituals, the Manchu Qing, who mastered the Chinese classics and governed through the Chinese bureaucracy. All of them arrived with the military power to impose whatever order they chose. All of them discovered, over time, that governing and conquering were different things, and that governing required working with a system they had not built and could not simply replace. China changed its conquerors more than its conquerors changed China. Not quickly, not completely, not without enormous suffering in the process, but over time, across generations, with the slow persistence of a civilization that measured its own continuity not in years or decades, but in centuries. This is the answer. China kept remaking itself without losing its identity, not despite the breaking, but through it. Every time the political structure collapsed, the cultural core survived. Every time the cultural core survived, it provided the foundation for a new political structure that called itself Chinese and genuinely was. The fractures were real. The losses were real. The suffering across 5,000 years of this history was profoundly and irreducibly real. But so was the continuity. And the continuity, in the end, proved stronger. There is an image that stays with you when you have spent time with this history. The Yellow River, China's sorrow, is still there. It is still flooding. It has flooded for 10,000 years. It will flood again. The communities along its banks learned, thousands of years ago, that survival required working together, that the river could not be individually resisted, only collectively managed. That lesson became an instinct. That instinct became a culture. That culture became a civilization. The civilization broke and rebuilt itself so many times that the breaking and rebuilding became part of what the civilization was. The dynasties came and went. The conquerors arrived and were absorbed. The philosophers argued, and their arguments became the operating system of governments they never lived to see. The historians wrote down what happened, carefully and sometimes at great personal cost, so that the people who came after would understand what they had inherited and what it had taken to preserve it. What are we? And how do we survive what is coming? The Yellow River is still flooding. China is still answering.